officers from California's Highway Patrol. They're now just a few metres away from the perimeter of this encampment. You can see there.
Now that's Martha Kellner, Sky's US correspondent, covering the pro-Palestinian protests on the University of California, Los Angeles campus in the early hours of this morning local time.
Just going to focus on this woman in front. She is a pro-Palestinian protester, and she is refusing to move for the California Highway Patrol. She is
UCLA, just the latest university to see protests of this type, and they're turning ever more tense and even violent.
She is now edging backwards. She appears to be kneeling down, perhaps in prayer, at the feet of the California Highway Patrol. I'm just going to leave that image with you.
Before UCLA on the West Coast, there was Columbia University in New York. Both have now seen police deployed, often in riot gear, an attempt to end what college administrators call unlawful protests.
Get off it! Get off of it! Get off of it!
And there are now similar demonstrations and occupations on campuses across the country, and increasing calls for the police or even the military to intervene, as of course they did in the student protests of the 60s and 70s. I'm Niall Paterson. This is the Sky News Daily. Well, the US is certainly no stranger to protests of this type. We will talk about that shortly with one American historian. But let's begin with our US correspondent, Mark Stone. Mark, specifically, where are you and what are you seeing? Because over your shoulder, I see what looks like quite a quiet, but potentially one of those places where people have been protesting.
I'm at George Washington University, 4 blocks or so from the White House in the heart of Washington, D.C. And this has been one point of protest, one of so many over the course of the country. It hasn't turned violent here at all. In fact, I've been here many times over the course of the past week, and I've always been struck at how peaceful it has been.
There does seem now to be a very defined, very clear pattern to these student protests. Pro-Palestinian students occupying buildings on university campuses, blocking themselves in, refusing to leave, asking for negotiations with university bosses. Remind us, though, where did all of this start?
It started with the Hamas attacks on Israel in October last year. It was after that point. It was the Israeli reaction to that awful day, which began to stir some students in some campuses around the United States. They were uneasy about the way in which Israel was reacting to the Hamas attacks, and they began to gather, and they gathered steam. And I think there was a point in last winter where I guess you could call it an inflection point, where here in Washington on Capitol Hill, some lawmakers who were particularly uneasy about what they saw the students doing, and they were very concerned that free speech was actually bleeding into hate speech and that anti-Semitism was part of this protest movement. They called some of the presidents of some of these Ivy League universities to Capitol Hill to answer their questions. And those conversations on Capitol Hill were public, they were televised, and they did not go well for those presidents of those universities. And it was after that point, I think, that the student movement really galvanized and they began to organize themselves.
What on earth does occupying a cafeteria on an Ivy League university campus have to do, A, with Gaza, and B, with changing Benjamin Netanyahu's mind?
Investment and divestment. There is, in many Ivy League universities, a lot of money that comes or that is invested in Israel. And I think that many of the students here want two things. They want divestment from Israel. They want to make sure that none of the money that is in their university, and these are private universities, these are universities that students pay to go to, none of their money is going to Israel. They want clarity on exactly where the money is going. And they want to make sure that, in simple terms, that these universities make public where their money goes to, and that they divest from any connection to Israel. So That is in simple terms what they want. But they also believe that by making a noise, and I'm just 4 blocks from the White House, they hope here in George Washington that Joe Biden will see and hear them. They want to make a noise, and they want to make sure that America has nothing to do with Israel's war on Gaza. And remember, at the moment, it is American money and American weapons that is fueling that war.
The pressure on Israel doesn't seem to be mounting as a result of these campus protests. The pressure on the universities individually seems to be mounting. We have had people like the billionaire Kraft suggesting that he is going to stop his funding of universities unless they clamp down on activity that he sees as running counter to free speech. We understand, of course, you've mentioned it already, on Capitol Hill, there is a huge amount of interest in the way in which these university authorities are policing or refusing to, as they would see it, not policing their campus.
I don't think it is as straightforward as the students might think, that if they make a loud noise that suddenly things will change and suddenly their universities will divest from investment in Israel. I don't think that is likely at all. But from Colombia, it has spread right across the country. And I think in that sense, whether it be the Biden administration or whether it would be governors in states around the country, they are hearing the anger from the student body without question.
Let's take this opportunity to talk about the Jewish students on campus. And I cannot be alone in having seen plenty of social media content suggesting that there are Jewish students on campus. One video I saw, he was wearing Star of David, who are being denied entry to their campus for their own safety, in inverted commas, not by the police, but by so-called campus cops. You don't have to delve too deeply into this story to see that there is an awful lot of unease, not just from the university authorities, not just from locals, but from Jewish students at these universities, which, as you pointed out, we shouldn't forget it, they've paid money, and they've paid an awful lot of money to go there to learn.
It's worth pointing out that among the protest groups that I've encountered here in New York, both at Columbia and at New York University, I have spoken to Jewish students who are with the protest movement. But there are many more who are not and who feel deeply uneasy, who feel threatened in many cases by what they are seeing and what they are hearing at this protest movement. Now, I've spoken to students who are part of the protest movement who say they have nothing against Jewish people. They have nothing against Jewish people who live in Israel. They are against Israel's actions in Gaza. But then that is perceived in different ways by different people. It is the offence is with the person who is hearing it, and it's become very, very uneasy at very many points over the course of the past few months. As you say, Jewish professors, Jewish students denied entry to their own universities because it is deemed to be unsafe for them to be there. That is very uneasy for them, offensive for them.
I'm looking at what we've seen at Columbia, at UCLA, at the University of Arizona. They put out a press release saying that students should stay away from campus because police were using chemical irritant munitions. At UCLA, I saw cops dressed in riot gear, batons out, gas masks on, ready to go in. And we will see these scenes repeated elsewhere. Is there no one on Capitol Hill, outside of the upper echelons, perhaps of the Democratic Party, who thinks back to 1968 and the violence that took place on campus?
It's extraordinary, and I think people sometimes have a quite short memory in America, and they sort of gasp at the state of America at the moment. So divided, we always hear that, but it's always been divided. I don't think we're there yet, anywhere near, but the prospect of the National Guard being sent into universities, it's happened before. It could certainly happen again.
Mark, thank you. Stay where you are. In a moment, we'll look back at the United States' often traumatic history of campus protest. Welcome back. To look forward, you must first look back. And recent US history can certainly inform our understanding of what's taking place. Let's not forget, at universities the length and breadth of the country. Lauren Lassabe Shepherd is a historian at the University of New Orleans. She's also the author of Resistance from the Right, Conservatives and the Campus Wars, and she joins us now. Just taking a look around the United States at the moment at the protests and indeed the violence that we are seeing in certain parts, to what do you attribute the strength of this now collective student protest in the United States?
I think the strength right now comes from the sympathy that this generation has with its other members. These protests are not new. We've had student calls for divestment and in solidarity with Palestine since October 7th. But the violence is new. And we first saw this a few weeks ago in April of 2024 in Nashville. And since then, it's inspired over 100 campuses in the U.S. To really heighten up their activism.
If, Lauren, you see parallels between the protests taking place right now and those of the 60s and 70s, I suspect that you also see parallels between the response from the universities then and now.
So the response in the 1960s, with what we've seen recently, is to call in either the police or the state military, which in the U.S. is the National Guard, to quell the protest. And if history, it can be instructive here, that doesn't tend to be what happens. If anything, it escalates the protest to another level. It certainly sets the stage and makes it more likely that violence will occur.
But these protests, in and of themselves, the occupation specifically, I mean, these are, according to the university authorities, unlawful protests.
Yes, I mean, there have been administrators who make those claims, but they're also fiddling with their policies. The night before they come out with these decrees that the protests are unlawful. That's something to bear in mind. All public campuses in the United States have free speech zones where students are allowed to exercise their First Amendment. At private institutions.
So compare and contrast what we are seeing right now with what you've been describing from your historian's perspective back in the 60s and the 70s. We have a highly motivated student body in various parts of the country, not listening to university administrators, not listening to security or indeed law enforcement in general, and continuing their protest. I look back at what happened in the 60s and 70s, and it is difficult not to remember the moment, when the National Guard is called in and when shots are fired. Do you think we're going in that direction right now?
Oh, I certainly hope not. We're here. It's May now. We're at the end of the semester, and I hope that our students can navigate the next few weeks safely. But I am worried that in the fall, as long as the war in Gaza continues, I think we can imagine that these protests will be back and will probably be much larger. And we also have a presidential election looming.
Indeed.
So we can draw some parallels there to 1968, which is when Richard Nixon was elected. And part of what helped him ride to his election victory was the national backlash against the student protest movement. In the case of Richard Nixon and also other candidates who are running, they campaigned against student protesters. They characterized them as un-American, unpatriotic, as communist sympathizers. And of course, this all had to do with not only the peace movement, but also the civil rights movement. If we bring this up today, the two presumptive presidential candidates are former President Donald Trump and our current President Joe Biden. There's not much daylight right now in May of 2024 between the two candidates' positions on the student protests. And both candidates have characterized the protests as anti-Semitic. Biden specifically has endorsed Columbia's use of the police to break up the sit-ins on campus. So how will that affect the students? I mean, so far, students have been pretty vocal about not being excited about the 2024 presidential election. Many have said that they are going to sit it out. And so if they do right now, according to polls, and the polls are always up in the air, but right now, Donald Trump is polling slightly ahead. So if Biden doesn't capture the youth vote along as some other key constituencies, that just tips the scales in Trump's favor.
I mean, it will obviously be, Lauren, a while before the history books about this particular chapter in American history are written. But what is your assessment of how well university authorities have handled this. I mean, I again, I think back to the 60s and the 70s, and there was chat at that point about, student protesters who might have been forcibly ejected from university, being given the McNamara Scholarship, essentially. They'd be up for the draft at that particular point. Fast forward to now, and we're seeing law firms, investment firms threatening to withdraw job offers. We're seeing major donors threaten to withdraw funding from universities as well.
So one very obvious parallel is that our students today don't have the threat of the draft, of course, and that's
Yes.
very different than some of the businesses that have come out and said that they won't hire the students. The consequences are vast. Many of these students now have arrest records, or they're facing expulsion, or they may not have the opportunity to participate in commencement, as some institutions have decided not to move forward with that this spring. I am sympathetic to the students who are exercising their right to free speech. They're exercising their right to protest. Of course, violence is definitely not protected within that. And anti-Semitism is something that no one should be in support of. And we should all call that out when we see it and condemn it. But I don't think that that's representative of the student movement writ large.
How effective is student protest as a means of affecting public policy change in the United States? It would be quite something if Benjamin Netanyahu sat up and listened to students at the University of Columbia. I will concede. But I'm just wondering, if we look slightly further back than these protests, whether students in the United States really have changed the minds of presidents, everyone from the president down in the past?
Well, I can tell you in the immediate, they were not successful throughout the late 1960s. They didn't even capture American hearts and minds. In fact, if we look at opinion polls, a majority of Americans, something like 60%, were in support of the National Guard.
As a historian, of course, you're rather more prone to looking back than looking forwards. But how does this all end, do you think?
Oh gosh, I really hope with the least amount of violence possible. But that's not really a easy call to make. That doesn't seem to be, at least looking historically, that's not how things have played out in the past. Kent State in 1970, when 4 students are executed by the National Guard and nearly a dozen others are injured, that's a turning point in the campus wars. And that's when we see, the protests sort of reach their crescendo. There's a major backlash immediately after, and then they sort of die down. But that terrible tragedy, is something that we certainly don't want for our students in the future.
Certainly not. Lauren Lassabe Shepherd, great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
There has been some doubt as to the organic nature of the spread of these protests. Also, some fairly snarky commentary around the supposed privilege displayed by those occupying buildings, not to mention blocking fellow scholars, including those of the Jewish faith, from getting to their studies. So no doubt there will be, as there always has been in this country, plenty of people rolling their eyes, sighing and muttering about bloody students. Still, it's difficult indeed to fake commitment to a cause when there's a gun pointed in your face, and it's not like the United States hasn't shot them dead before. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll be back again soon.